Imagine an empire so vast, so powerful, it believed itself untouchable. For centuries, its fleets darkened the skies of countless worlds. Its legions marched with an iron grip, enforcing a rule so absolute that resistance seemed laughable. To them, victory was inevitable, and submission was destiny. But what happens when that arrogance collides with something even greater? Not superior weapons, not a rival empire, but the unbreakable will of ordinary people, the kind of will that refuses to bow, refuses to yield, and refuses to die quietly. This is the story of how a superpower fell, not by might alone, but by the indomitable spirit of humanity. Stay with me, because by the end of this tale, you'll see exactly how arrogance can blind even the greatest empire, and how the unstoppable will of mankind can turn the impossible into history. And if you love stories where humanity proves time and again that we are never to be underestimated, make sure you subscribe to HFY Aliens Battle, where every tale reminds us of who we truly are. For as long as anyone could remember, the Empire was the center of all things. Its banners flew above star systems spanning light years, its fleets patrolled the void like predators, and its rulers spoke with the certainty of gods. When they entered a world's orbit, resistance crumbled before the first shot was ever fired. Entire civilizations bent the knee simply at the sight of their warships, colossal vessels bristling with weapons that could erase cities in the blink of an eye. Their power was not only military. The Empire had perfected control. Through fear, propaganda, and ruthless efficiency, they convinced the galaxy that no alternative existed. The Empire was order. The Empire was destiny. To imagine life without their iron grip was considered madness. Arrogance had seeped into every corner of their being. To the imperial elite, other species were not equals but subjects, curiosities to be studied, labor to be exploited, obstacles to be crushed. They looked upon the galaxy as a farmer looks upon fields of grain, and upon themselves as harvesters, taking and consuming without end. For centuries, this belief went unchallenged. They had never lost a war, never faced a foe who truly tested their might. Every enemy had either surrendered or been annihilated. Their historians wrote that their empire would stand for 1,000 years more, unbroken, unassailable, eternal. It was this arrogance, this unshakable belief in their own invincibility, that became their greatest weakness. Because when you believe you cannot be defeated, you stop learning. You stop adapting. You stop seeing the warning signs. And so, when whispers began to spread of a species still unclaimed, still independent, the Empire barely noticed. They laughed at the idea that such a minor race could ever resist their rule. They expected no challenge, no true fight, just another world added to their endless collection. That species was humanity. At first, the Empire treated humanity as little more than a footnote. Reports described us as a late-blooming species, still young compared to the elder civilizations of the stars. We had only recently reached beyond our home system, building fragile colonies across nearby worlds and asteroids. To the Empire, we were small, scattered, insignificant. When their first warships entered human space, they expected the same reaction they had seen countless times before: panic, surrender, submission. The arrival of their dreadnoughts was meant to end the story before it even began. Yet what they encountered was different. The first skirmishes were brutally one-sided. Outposts burned, colonies were crushed, and human fleets were scattered. The Empire's commanders dismissed the resistance as laughable, nothing more than insects throwing stones at titans. But buried within those early battles was something the Empire did not recognize, something that would prove fatal. Even in defeat, humanity refused to break. Entire defense crews chose to fight until their stations were torn apart, leaving nothing but wreckage drifting through space. Pilots, outnumbered 10 to 1, stayed in the fight, hurling their last missiles even as their ships burned. Ground soldiers fought street by street, turning every ruined city into a battlefield, forcing the Empire to bleed for every inch of land they took. This was not the submission the Empire was used to. Instead of falling to despair, humanity grew fiercer. The Empire could not comprehend it. To them, losing was dishonor, and dishonor meant surrender. But to humanity, losing was only a moment, not the end. We could lose a battle, lose a city, lose a world, and still come back swinging. One report from an imperial admiral, preserved in the archives, captures their confusion perfectly. The humans do not fight as others do. They do not surrender when logic demands it. They resist even when resistance is futile. It is as if their will to defy us outweighs their very instinct to survive. At first, the Empire laughed at these observations. They believed this defiance was simply foolishness, the desperation of primitives who did not understand their place. They assumed humanity's stubbornness would crumble under the weight of overwhelming force, as it always had with others. But arrogance blinds. And in their blindness, they failed to see that humanity's defiance was not weakness. It was strength, the seed of something greater, the beginning of a storm that would one day sweep the Empire away. To the Empire, the war against humanity was not a war at all. It was supposed to be a cleanup operation, a brief campaign to subdue another insignificant race. They delegated the conflict to lesser admirals, assigned only a fraction of their fleets, and issued orders with casual arrogance. Subdue them quickly. Do not waste resources. This is beneath us. And for a time, the Empire's confidence seemed justified. Their fleets won battle after battle, their armies descended on human colonies like storms, and their governors began drawing up plans for occupation. Yet in their pride, they failed to notice what was happening in the shadows. Humans were learning. Every defeat was a lesson. Every lost battle revealed something new about the Empire's tactics, technology, and vulnerabilities. Where others saw annihilation, humanity saw data. Engineers scavenged wreckage from fallen enemy ships, decoding their systems, adapting them to human designs. Strategists studied the Empire's formations, spotting patterns and predicting movements. Soldiers hardened with each clash, their morale somehow rising, not falling. The Empire dismissed human victories as accidents, statistical anomalies. A single squadron ambushing an Imperial patrol was ignored. A colony resisting occupation longer than expected was brushed aside. But each of these anomalies was part of a larger truth. Humanity was adapting faster than the Empire realized. Worse still, arrogance made the Empire sloppy. Commanders underestimated their foes and grew careless. Supply lines stretched thin, outposts left underdefended, fleets split apart for efficiency. They believed humanity too weak to exploit these mistakes. They believed wrong. Human resistance began striking where it hurt most, not in grand battles, but in precision strikes. Convoys vanished in ambushes. Communication hubs were sabotaged. Occupied worlds erupted in rebellion the moment Imperial troops grew complacent. It was not overwhelming force that bled the Empire, it was death by 1,000 cuts, each one delivered by hands they thought too small to matter. One Imperial governor complained bitterly in a report. We defeat them in the open field, yet they are never defeated. They scatter, vanish, then strike again from the shadows. It is like fighting the very darkness of space itself. But instead of rethinking their strategy, the Empire doubled down on arrogance. They sent even fewer resources, certain that resistance was collapsing. They ignored the mounting evidence, laughed at the warnings from their own commanders, and told themselves the war was already won. What they failed to understand was that humanity had already begun turning the tide. The Empire's arrogance had given humans the most valuable weapon of all, time. Time to learn. Time to adapt. Time to transform from prey into predators. And soon, the mistakes born of arrogance would no longer be minor inconveniences. They would become the cracks that shattered an empire. For the Empire, war was a matter of numbers. Fleets, soldiers, weapons, and resources. In their calculations, humanity should have surrendered long ago. Any logical species would have bent the knee, begged for mercy, and accepted their place as subjects. But humanity is not logical in the way the Empire understood. Across burning colonies, shattered stations, and blockaded worlds, ordinary men and women rose from the rubble and refused to yield. When power grids failed, they lit fires. When weapons ran dry, They turned factories into forges, melting wreckage into bullets and armor. Farmers became fighters, engineers became tacticians, and children grew up not in fear, but in defiance. The Empire could destroy cities, but not the human will to rebuild. They could erase entire armies, but not the determination of survivors to keep fighting. They could break bodies, but not the spirit that bound humanity together. There are countless stories whispered through the resistance. Stories the Empire tried to erase, but which lived on in human memory. A single platoon holding a mountain pass against an entire legion, not for hours but for days, buying precious time for civilians to escape. Colonists on a frozen world who, when their food supplies were cut off, hunted the very predators of their wilderness and turned them into weapons against imperial soldiers. Even children in occupied cities smuggled messages, weapons, and hope beneath the noses of their oppressors. This spirit confused the Empire. To them, survival was obedience. To humans, survival was resistance. And as the war dragged on, the difference grew clearer. For every world the Empire conquered, resistance sprang anew. For every fleet destroyed, another emerged, patched together from wreckage, crewed by survivors who had lost everything and had nothing left to fear. Humanity's strength was not in superior technology, nor overwhelming force. It was in the refusal to accept defeat. An old saying among human soldiers became the quiet anthem of the resistance. We do not stop. We do not yield. We do not break. Those words spread across the stars, whispered in the shadows, painted on ruined walls, broadcast in pirate signals the Empire could never fully silence. The Empire began to realize a truth it had never faced before. You can conquer land, destroy armies, and burn cities, but you cannot conquer a spirit that refuses to bow. And that spirit was becoming a weapon more dangerous than any fleet humanity could build. For years, humanity fought only to endure, to hold the line, to survive another day, another battle, another storm. But endurance has a way of transforming into strength. What began as desperation evolved into mastery, and slowly, the hunters became the hunted. The Empire had given humanity something it never intended. Time. Time to learn, time to adapt, time to unite. Scavenged wreckage from downed Imperial warships became the foundation of new fleets. Engineers cracked alien code, bending Imperial technology to human use. Weapons once beyond imagination were suddenly turned back upon their creators. What the Empire called primitive ingenuity became humanity's greatest weapon. When resources ran thin, humans innovated. When outnumbered, they adapted. When cornered, they fought harder. Entire colonies transformed into fortresses, space stations became shipyards, and old mining rigs were converted into war platforms bristling with cannons. Then came the first great victory. A human strike force, ragtag, underpowered, and dismissed as irrelevant, ambushed a convoy carrying supplies to the front. Against all odds, they captured not just resources, but an entire Imperial battleship. That single act sent shockwaves through the galaxy. The Empire dismissed it as a fluke, but other species, long silent under Imperial rule, began to watch with new eyes. More victories followed. Human fleets struck deep into supply lines, severing lifelines the Empire assumed untouchable. Resistance cells coordinated across multiple star systems, hitting targets in perfect synchronization. What had once been isolated sparks of defiance ignited into a wildfire. Imperial commanders, frustrated and humiliated, labeled humanity's tactics as dishonorable as terrorism. They mocked the ambushes, the raids, the sabotage. But the truth was undeniable. For the first time in living memory, the Empire was being bled. Every victory, no matter how small, carried weight. For humanity, they were proof that the Empire could be hurt. For the Empire, they were seeds of doubt. Their soldiers began to whisper, if these humans can win once, what else might they achieve? It was a question the Empire's rulers refused to ask. They still saw humanity as an annoyance, not a threat. Their arrogance remained even as the cracks in their foundations widened. And humanity was no longer content to merely survive. They had tasted victory, and they would not let it go. The tide of war had begun to turn. The Empire had always believed victory was inevitable. And when humanity began carving victories from the jaws of defeat, Imperial leaders reacted not with humility or caution, but with fury. Their arrogance demanded an explanation. This was not a failing of strategy or strength. It was luck, cowardice, insignificant anomalies. They convinced themselves that one decisive strike would end the matter forever. So they doubled down. They committed more fleets, more troops, more resources than ever before. But in their rage, they ignored the truth staring them in the face. Their empire was vast, yes, but stretched thin. Their arrogance had led them to underestimate logistics, morale, and the human talent for turning weakness into advantage. Armadas that should have been unstoppable were forced into extended campaigns across hostile systems. Convoys, once protected by reputation alone, now had to travel under heavy escort, bleeding resources. And every time the Empire massed its power, humanity struck elsewhere, cutting lines, shattering communications, and forcing them to chase shadows. The result was chaos. Imperial soldiers, once confident and disciplined, began to feel fear. Rumors spread that humanity was everywhere, that any patrol could vanish, any outpost could burn, any general could fall to a nameless insurgent. Even their most loyal commanders began to whisper doubts. For the first time in living memory, the Empire was losing control. Entire campaigns stalled as uprisings erupted across occupied worlds. Other subject species, long silent under imperial chains, began to resist. The example of humanity spread like wildfire. If the Empire could bleed, then perhaps it could die. But still, the rulers of the Empire refused to accept the truth. To acknowledge humanity as a legitimate threat would be to admit weakness, and arrogance blinded them even as their foundations cracked. They ordered more purges, more bombings, more shows of force, each act of brutality only fueling the fire of rebellion. An empire built on fear was now ruled by fear itself. And in the shadows of collapsing campaigns, humanity pressed harder. They no longer fought merely for survival. They fought for victory. And every battle, every strike, every scar they inflicted brought the Empire one step closer to the abyss. The arrogance that had carried the Empire through centuries of domination was now the very chain dragging it toward destruction. The collapse had begun. The Empire's fleets had once darkened the skies, their legions marching with the weight of inevitability. But now, their ships lay scattered across battlefields, their soldiers broken, their governors overthrown. The great machine that had ruled the galaxy for centuries groaned and cracked under the weight of its own arrogance. And at the heart of it all stood humanity. World by world, system by system, the Empire retreated. They still had superior numbers, still had advanced weapons, but none of it mattered anymore. Their enemies no longer feared them. Humanity had proven what none dared believe, that the Empire could be resisted, could be beaten, could be brought to its knees. The final campaigns were not won by overwhelming firepower, but by sheer will. Human fleets, cobbled together from stolen technology and wreckage, stood toe-to-toe with imperial armadas. Colonists rose in rebellion before the Empire could regroup. Soldiers fought with a fury born not of conquest, but of survival, of vengeance, of hope. When the Empire's capital world finally fell, it was not with the blaze of annihilation the rulers had threatened, but with silence. Their fleets refused to answer orders. Their soldiers surrendered rather than die in a war they no longer believed in. The arrogance that once bound their rule had shattered into dust. And humanity, battered, bloodied, scarred, stood unbroken. The galaxy watched in awe. Here was not a superpower with endless fleets, not an ancient race with technology beyond comprehension. Here was a people who had clawed victory from the jaws of certain defeat, not through strength of arms alone, but through a will so unyielding that no empire could crush it. For the first time, the galaxy saw humanity not as weak, not as primitive, but as something far more dangerous, indomitable. In the ruins of the Empire, humanity did not proclaim themselves conquerors. They did not enslave or subjugate those who had once mocked them. Instead, they rebuilt. They reached out to other species, not as overlords, but as allies. They showed the galaxy a truth far greater than arrogance, that unity born of will can outlast even the mightiest of empires. The empire's arrogance was gone, but humanity's spirit remained. And in that spirit, a new future was forged, one where the unbreakable will of ordinary people had reshaped the stars themselves. So, what happens when the arrogance of an empire collides with the unstoppable will of humanity? The answer lies in the ashes of a fallen superpower. The empire believed itself eternal, its rule unshakable, its power absolute. But arrogance blinds, and in that blindness, they underestimated the one force they could never conquer, the human spirit. We were not the strongest. We were not the most advanced. But we refused to bow, refused to yield, and refused to break. And in that refusal, we did what no empire believed possible. We endured, we fought back, and we prevailed. The empire is gone. Humanity remains. And let that be the lesson carried through the stars. True power is not measured in fleets or weapons, but in the will to stand when all else falls. That is humanity's gift, humanity's curse, and humanity's triumph. If this story moved you, remember, there are countless more battles, countless more tales of defiance, and countless more moments when humanity shows why we are never to be underestimated. Subscribe to HFY Aliens Battle for more stories of survival, defiance, and victory against the impossible. Because in the end, arrogance falls. But will endures forever.